They tried to erase this story from memory. They tried to bury it in the hills of West Virginia, where silence was supposed to be stronger than truth. But silence is never permanent, and what grows in shadows always finds its way back into the light. Imagine a woman sitting by a window, unmoving year after year, her body alive, but her voice sealed her presence, both haunting and magnetic. You have seen her face, even if you did not know her name, Lorraine Whittaker, the woman the internet calls the most inbred mom in American history. But the truth behind her life is far more than a viral curiosity. It is a descent into the machinery of genetic collapse, psychological isolation, and the hidden systems that create families like hers. She does not speak, not with words yet. Her silence is not emptiness. It is language, written in absence in the tilt of her head, in the way she leans when touched in the rhythm of her existence. Every detail of her life reflects a cycle older than she is, a cycle written into her bloodline. Beginning with two brothers whose children became husbands and wives, beginning with marriages that ignored boundaries and created a loop of inheritance that grew tighter with every generation, until Lorraine was born carrying history in her body, like a chain she never chose. The house where she sits is not only a structure of wood and stone, it is a vault of secrets. The floors creak with repetition. The walls are stained with decades of poverty. The air carries the weight of voices lost to silence. Her family does not speak in the way you and I do, but they are not absent. They grunt, they gesture, they hum. They live inside a system of communication. Outsiders cannot decode yet. Inside the house, it is fluent. It is their world. And here lies the forbidden truth. What you are seeing is not an accident. It is not random. It is not fate alone. It is the outcome of geography, poverty, and control. Generations trapped not only by bloodlines, but by institutions that left them here forgotten until the cameras arrived. Lorraine is more than a woman at a window. She is a monument to cycles that stretch across centuries, cycles of power and silence. Cycles that rulers have always used to keep families like hers invisible and yet unforgettable once seen. Step deeper into the hills and you begin to see that Lorraine's silence is not hers alone. It is the silence of a family bound together by ties too close for comfort. Every face in that house tells the same story. Wide-set eyes, movements that do not match the rhythm of the outside world. Voices reduced to grunts and hums, and behind it all a history of choices made in isolation. Marriages between cousins, siblings, unions designed not by desire, but by proximity. Poverty and the absence of outsiders created a loop that tightened with each generation until voices were lost and futures collapsed. Lorraine's mother carried the same traits her father too. Their union was another link in a chain forged long before they were born. Imagine being born into a script already written, a play where the ending is always the same, and yet you must perform it again and again. Outsiders may call it curse or madness, but the truth is less supernatural and far more chilling. It is the result of neglect. Communities left to rot by the world beyond the mountains, resources stripped, opportunities denied, until families turned inward to survive. Survival itself created the very cycles outsiders now call unnatural. The cameras that arrived decades later did not bring rescue. They brought spectacle. They turned Lorraine and her family into exhibits, filmed not to heal, but to entertain audiences, consumed their lives like horror stories, clicking replay without ever asking, what created this reality? The family became myth, while the conditions that birthed them remained invisible. Generations trapped in poverty and forgotten by policy. Their existence was never supposed to be seen, except as a warning, as a spectacle, as a ghost story whispered about, but never understood. Lorraine became the image at the center of it all, frozen in her chair, a woman who did not speak. yet spoke volumes about history, power, and silence. She is called the most inbred mom, but that title erases her humanity. It reduces her to a headline, when in truth she is the evidence of a system that built cages and then mocked the people trapped inside them. The real horror is not Lorraine. The real horror is the design that made her inevitable. Her silence may have been the most visible mark, but the story of Lorraine did not end at her chair. It carried forward into her children, each one born with the weight of the same history pressing on their bodies and their minds. The genetic loop that began generations earlier did not loosen. It tightened further, shaping their faces, their voices, their futures, before they had a chance to claim them. Outsiders who later entered their world saw only deformity or strangeness. But what they missed was the quiet endurance of children carrying burdens they never chose. Imagine being born into a family already branded by whispers. Every step outside the house watched, every glance judged. Before a word could even be spoken, children became echoes of their mother's silence. Not because they lacked thought or feeling, but because society trained them to remain unseen. Stigma is a cage as real as poverty. When your last name is marked, you are marked too. Doors close before they open. Opportunities vanish before they appear. The world makes your existence into a spectacle before you can decide who you are. Lorraine's children grew up in a place where outsiders visited with cameras in hand, curiosity painted as compassion, but always ending in exposure. They were never asked what they wanted, their voices never amplified, only recorded to be consumed. Their lives turned into chapters of a myth. They never agreed to tell survival for them was not about thriving. It was about carrying a family name that had already been condemned. It was about enduring laughter, whispers, and the weight of being born into a story already told. Some of them leaned into silence while others tried to break away. But even those who left were pulled back by memory, by blood, by the gravity of stigma. Lorraine's children reveal the cruel truth that cycles are not only genetic, they are psychological. Once the world brands, you escape, become. It's almost impossible because the cage is built inside your own mind. They were not monsters. They were not curiosities. They were human beings navigating a system that reduced them to examples and warnings. Living proof that history does not die. It multiplies. The story of Lorraine and her bloodline did not remain hidden forever. Outsiders came with lenses and notepads pretending to document truth. But what they were really doing was feeding hunger, a hunger for spectacle. The camera became a weapon, turning private suffering into public entertainment under the guise of awareness. What began as whispers in small towns transformed into viral videos, watched by millions. Every pause, every grunt, every gesture replayed, dissected, judged by strangers who knew nothing of the silence behind those walls. The watchers called it compassion. They said they wanted to help, but help dressed in exploitation is just another form of control. The Whittakers became subjects of curiosity, like an old carnival sideshow repackaged for the digital age. Only now the audience stretched across the globe. Every comment a dart, every view a coin, feeding the algorithm. Not their survival donations arrived, sometimes food, sometimes clothes, but with every gift came more eyes, more judgment, more invisible chains of dependence. No one asked Lorraine if she wanted to be seen. No one asked her children if they consented to the world knowing their names. And yet the institutions that should have protected them, schools, hospitals, social systems, remained silent because poverty in the hills is not a scandal. It is a shadow. And shadows are easier to ignore than to confront. For decades, officials knew, but turned away because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging failure. It is easier to brand a family cursed by their own choices than to admit that society built the walls that trapped them. Geography, poverty, stigma, these were not accidents. They were tools sharpened over time, so the Whittakers were left exposed, stripped of privacy. Their image a currency traded online. Their story recited as a warning, as if inbreeding alone explained everything. The truth was more dangerous. The truth was that neglect had been institutionalized, generations forgotten, not because they were hidden, but because they were inconvenient. Lorraine's stillness became a mirror, reflecting not just her family, but the systems that thrive on silence. She was not simply a woman in a chair. She was a testimony to how far a society will go to turn people into myths instead of confronting its own guilt. There is a reason stories like Lorraine's never reach the full truth, because truth in this world is a dangerous currency. It cannot be allowed to spread freely, so instead the masses are fed fragments. Carefully framed images, clipped moments, shaped into narratives that serve power, not people. When you watch Lorraine sitting silent by the window, you are not just watching her. You are watching the architecture of control in action. An architecture that convinces the world she is an anomaly, while hiding the fact that her suffering was engineered. Understand this. Every society creates its scapegoats, families, marked as cursed villages labeled degenerate lineages, branded defective, because once the label is attached, no one has to ask harder questions. No one has to ask why poverty persists, why hospitals vanish from rural maps, why entire towns are left to rot, with no industry, no infrastructure, no education. The label becomes the answer. Inbreeding, they say, as if that single word explains away centuries of neglect and systemic abandonment, and in repeating it, they protect the system that caused it. Lorraine's silence is interpreted as emptiness, but silence itself is a language, a kind of refusal to perform for a world that wants her suffering, packaged neatly in viral clips. Her stillness is not absence, it is resistance, because even without words, she reveals the truth that they cannot erase. She exists, she endures, and endurance is a rebellion against those who would rather her family disappear from memory completely. This is where you must look deeper, not just at the Whittakers, but at your own life. Ask yourself what labels have been given to you, what quiet prisons have been built around you, with words, with categories, with diagnoses, with statistics. The mechanism is the same: reduce people to something less than human, make them believe they are powerless, convince them their fate is sealed. Then, sit back as they repeat the chains themselves. This is psychological warfare dressed as social order, and here is where you must participate to prove that you are not blind type. The phrase, "I see the hidden hand" twice in the comments, because this is not just a story about Lorraine, it is a mirror. And once you see the hand guiding the narrative, you cannot unsee it, and you will never again believe the lies they want you to. You have now descended far enough to recognize that the Whittaker story is not isolated. It is part of something older, something buried beneath centuries of human history and power. Every civilization has its bloodlines, the families chosen or cursed to carry the weight of silence, some exalted as royalty, others condemned as degenerates, yet both manipulated by the same invisible law. Keep the blood pure. Keep the control contained. Bloodlines are not just genetics. They are instruments of domination. Look at the dynasties of the ancient world, the pharaohs of Egypt, marrying sisters to preserve divine right, the monarchs of Europe wedded to cousins in endless loops to keep crowns from slipping from their heads. They told the people it was about purity, but purity was always code for control. Inbreeding was not only a Whittaker tragedy, it was an elite weapon, and it was practiced both at the top of pyramids and at the bottom of forgotten valleys. The difference is that when the powerful did it, They called it tradition when the poor did it. They called it sin. So when you see Lorraine sitting in silence, you are looking at the shadow. Reflection of kings and emperors. She is the mirror. They do not want you to hold up, because it proves their rituals of control trickle downward, poisoning not just their own heirs, but entire societies kept in isolation and poverty through the same obsession with blood and power. The Whittakers did not invent this cycle. They inherited it, and so did you, because every man alive today carries within him the fingerprints of ancient manipulation. The cycles of control are written into our families, our cultures, our very bones. You are told your choices are your own, but look closer at how much of your life is decided before you are even aware your name, your blood, your environment, your so-called fate. Just as Lorraine inherited the consequences of generations, you too inherit T-chains disguised as tradition and identity. The danger lies in believing it cannot be broken. The elites of every age rely on your silence, your acceptance, your willingness to laugh at the Whittakers, and ignore the kings who do the same in golden halls while calling it legacy. But the truth is, once you see the bloodlines for what they are, the illusion shatters and their control weakens. History is not distant. It is alive inside you, and once you awaken, you begin to rewrite it. Now you arrive at the edge of the story where the light thins and the truth becomes a blade. Lorraine's life is not a cautionary tale to be skimmed and forgotten. It is a test that asks what you will do with forbidden knowledge once it finds you. Sitting by that window, she does not ask for rescue. She refuses to be reduced to pity. Her stillness is a summons, a mirror held up to every man who thinks power is only about crowns and money. The real power is the one that writes destiny into blood, the power that convinces whole communities to accept cages as home. This is the moment when you must decide whether you will look away or whether you will carry the lesson further. The Whittaker saga reveals how easy it is to manufacture victims and villains. The same system that turned lineage into a spectacle also teaches you to treat suffering as entertainment. That is the mechanism you must see and break. Brandon and Luis, Lorraine and the others are survivors and symbols. They are the evidence that systems of control can be mapped, not romanticized. Once you understand the mapping, you gain leverage over it. Listen closely, because the final truth is simple and brutal. The cages that held Lorraine were built from geography, policy, neglect, and narrative, not from fate alone. If you want to dismantle such cages, you must attack each pillar. Rebuild infrastructure where it was torn down, restore schools that were shuttered, demand health care that arrives before cameras do, refuse the lazy explanations that blame blood instead of broken systems. When charity becomes a camera flash, you have not helped. You have merely prolonged the performance that keeps the design intact. You are being taught to feel disgust and then to forget. That is deliberate. Prestige and power survive by generating cheap moral victories while leaving the deeper rot untouched. The Whittakers were showcased, debated, monetized, and rarely supported in ways that change trajectory. Fighting the architecture means long-term investment, political will, and the courage to name structural violence when you see it. That is the work of men who refuse to be comfortable with convenient narratives. So carry this with seriousness. Type the phrase you read earlier twice to mark the shift. Say, I see the hidden hand. I see the hidden hand, and know that your comment is not ritual. It is a pledge to notice, to question, to act. Do not let that pledge be performative. Let it be the hinge that changes how you move through the world. When men like you begin to demand different systems, when you refuse the cheap spectacle and insist on remediation, then the cages start to crack. Remember, the most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that makes you accountable. Now you know where the fault lines run. Now you know the method. The choice is yours. Either step back into comfortable ignorance or step forward and become the kind of man who dismantles designs that sacrifice the vulnerable for entertainment. Lorraine's life will not be erased again if you carry this truth and refuse to make her tragedy into someone else's pastime.